We're going to talk a little bit about how timing impacts accounting, because that's actually one of the biggest challenges that they have to overcome, is keeping things in order by fiscal period. We'll talk about what's called accrual versus cash basis accounting, or accrual versus deferral, and understanding when to recognize both money in and money out, or revenue and expenses. Let's first talk about the idea of timing. We casually talked about this yesterday when you were taking notes, but accountants divide the economic life of a business into artificial time periods, or what's called the time period assumption. Please highlight or circle or make a notation in your notes of that definition, because that's certainly a new vocab term for this chapter. So I'll say it again. Time period assumption divides the economic life of a business into artificial time periods. We'll get into what's called fiscal year in a minute, but you can take a look at doing things by month, by quarter, by year, or I would even add semi-annually or every 6 months. And it's just breaking up the fiscal year into smaller chunks. The larger the business, typically the more reporting and more reports they have to do. You hear of people having to do monthly reports or quarterly reports. We'll get into how corporations have to do this more often than just on an annual basis, but you just need to know that time period assumption breaks up the economic life of a business into time periods. A little bit about what a fiscal year is versus a calendar year. I actually want to talk about this one first. A fiscal year is actually the accounting time period that lasts 1 year in length. Versus a calendar year is always January 1 to December 31st. Are they sometimes the same? A lot of times they're the same. A lot of times a fiscal year and a calendar year are the same. If any of your parents are business owners, go ask them, when does your fiscal year end? And a lot will say, well, we follow the calendar year. I talked about the school yesterday. When does the school's fiscal year begin? I would say most schools are a July 1 fiscal year. So their fiscal year ends June 30th, starts on July 1. We briefly discussed this, but why? Why do schools do it that way? It is. We're gone. The students and teachers are gone. And it's a little bit quieter in that middle of that transition time. We're wrapping up one school year, starting the next. Okay. Think about, I'm trying to come up with the word, are there certain industries that are slower at certain times of the year and much busier at other times? Take anything that's outdoor based, like a landscaping business. They probably don't end their fiscal year on January 1 or July 1 because they are in the middle of their craziness. So I'd encourage you to ask people who you know in the business world and find out what they do for their fiscal year end. I just realized I don't have my connection software on. Not that you're off task without it, but it's nice to see it in front of you. All right, this is the big one that I think is a little bit confusing from the chapter. Accrual versus cash basis accounting, or you often hear this one referred to as deferral. I don't know if I got that spelled right. My apologies there. Accrual versus deferral or cash basis accounting. What you need to know is what GAAP thinks of both of these. Now, what's GAAP again? GAAP. Generally Accepted Accounting Principles. So basically, the governing board of the accounting world. GAAP likes this one. GAAP doesn't like that one. Does that mean you can't use cash basis? No. It's just that GAAP prefers that you use what's called accrual basis accounting. Let's talk a little bit more about what they mean. Accrual basis accounting recognizes events when they happen. With or without cash. Accrual basis accounting doesn't need cash to show up for it to be deemed an economic event. So if I sell supplies on account, I'm going to record that when it happens. The question is, have my accounts payable paid me yet? No. Cash basis accounting would not even record the economic event until the cash shows up at your door. Do you see how that gets a little bit messy? So what you need to realize is that GAAP likes accrual, and accrual is simply record the event when it happens, whether there's cash at your door or not. So then cash basis only recognizes events when the cash comes in, or out for that matter. Yes. It typically has to do with cash. Yep, good question. Let's talk a little bit more about accrual. We'll talk about sales and expenses in a minute. Cash basis, or accrual basis accounting. Transactions recording in the periods in which the events occur. This becomes a big issue with timing. Okay, what if it's December 31st? And on December 31st, the calendar year is ending and our fiscal year is ending. I make a sale. Let's just use a haircut place as an example. Someone's getting a New Year's Eve haircut, okay? And they say, send me the bill. In accrual basis accounting, we are going to count that event when it happened, whether we have the cash in our pockets or not. So we are recognizing transactions in which the period in which they happen. Companies recognize revenue when they perform the service rather than waiting for cash. And we record expenses when they happen rather when they're paid. So it's all happening real time. Accrual is happening real time, whether cash is on the table or not. And that's money in or money out. Let me give you an example of money out or an expense. The utility bill, okay? We've got the lights on until the end of December, right? Or the heat. Maybe our bill isn't due until January 3rd. But we're going to recognize the expense of having the lights on that we're going to pay later. We're recognizing the money in, whether the money's there or not, or a sale. We're recognizing all of our expenses that happen, whether we've paid our bill or not, when they happen. That's accrual based. Tell me one more time about GAAP with accrual based. They like it. Why? Because it's not so under the table. It's not so shady. It's not, we had this sale, but we're going to wait until we get the money to tell anyone that it happened. Cash basis. What's another word for cash basis accounting? We've got revenue, we've got expenses, but we're not going to recognize that revenue until the cash is received. So I might have that haircut on December 31st, and the guy will come back in and pay me a couple days later. I'm not going to recognize that revenue until the money shows up. And on the flip side, I'm not going to recognize an expense until I pay my cash. You'll notice a little visit with GAAP again. Cash basis or deferral basis accounting is not in accordance with the generally accepted accounting principles. You might say, why? What's the big deal? It's not happening real time. If I cut someone's hair on December 31st, it happened on December 31st, whether they paid me or not. And so cash basis, we don't want to wait around for the cash. We had that sale. We performed that service on that day. I have a handout for you. I thought I had a handout. What? Okay, I guess I don't have a handout for you. My apologies. If you would like to write this in your notes, you're welcome to. Just draw yourself this quick table. Basically, we're going to look at accrual versus a cash and what is it, when is it, pros and cons, and an example. Just a way to talk through it again. And then I've got a really lame YouTube video to show you. If you thought the wrap was bad, this one's worse. My apologies. I thought I got those printed. Let's first identify again, we've talked about it twice now. I did a versus slide and then we identified a little bit more, but I can't stress enough the importance of letting this sink in. So what is accrual basis? It's, again, recognizing events as they happen. With or without cash. Cash basis, we're only going to recognize the event when the cash shows up. Only recognizing the economic event when cash is present. Going back to accrual, when is it happening? It's very much real time. If I give someone that haircut on December 31st, I gave someone the haircut. We earned our revenue. We might not have gotten paid for it yet, but it happened real time. Okay? We're not necessarily going to wait for the cash. And that's no different. That's just basically an AR. Okay, we had a sale. That's our credit. The AR is our debit. That's very common in accounting where people say, charge me. We'll pay later. Okay? When is cash basis? If we're using the cash basis accounting or deferral based accounting, when's that happening? It's a waiting game. We're waiting for cash to show up. And it seems a little bit shady because the haircut happened last fiscal year, but maybe didn't pay us until the new fiscal year, and it seems a little dirty. What's a good thing about Accrual, GAAP likes it, which is the bad thing about cash basis. GAAP doesn't like that. Another big pro with accrual, it's very ethics based. There's no smoke and mirrors. When we gave the haircut, we recognized the revenue then, whether or not we got paid. A pro on cash basis, the money's there. We might be waiting, but the money, the cash pile is sitting there in front of us, so that could be deemed as a pro. What's a con of accrual? What's something that's bad about the accrual system? Yes. Ah, good one. There's maybe a smaller amount of cash on hand. It's a really good one, Ira. Others? Do we take on some risk when we let people charge? Risk of not getting paid. It's actually one of our, I think, a very fascinating chapter when we analyze turnovers on how quickly we can get our cash out of AR. It's actually kind of a cool chapter. Some examples, the one I already mentioned, the haircut on December 31st. We're recognizing, so AR would be the debit, sales revenue, service revenue would be the credit. Okay, and then they're going to pay in January. Especially if we're ending our fiscal period on December 31st, we need to recognize that as that fiscal year's revenue, not the next fiscal year's revenue. Okay, a cash basis example. Basically the same haircut story, but waiting. Oh, my smartboard needs to be calibrated. Woo! Waiting until January to even record. Oh, I'm going to just stop. It's really screwed up down in that corner. Waiting, acting like we didn't even have that haircut on on December 31st. Waiting until the cash shows up and saying, oh yeah, by the way, we had that sales or service revenue. Sorry, that's such a mess down there. I'm going to pause and show you a quick video. So basically, it's a timing issue to make sure you're recording economic events in the fiscal period that they happen. How do you recognize your revenue? How do you recognize your expenses? And it all goes back to recording it when it happens, okay? The revenue recognition principle is this. You recognize revenue in the accounting period in which you performed the obligation. So if I cut hair, if I change oil, if I clean teeth, I need to record that revenue when it happened, whether or not cash came with it. Do people sometimes pay cash on the spot? So that's not cash basis. That's simply, yeah, hey, we're getting our money when it actually happens. So if it's under accrual basis accounting, you recognize the revenue when it happens, with or without the cash. Expenses then match expenses with the revenue in the period when the expense makes its contribution to the revenue. What you need to know with expense recognition principle, let the expenses follow the revenue. This is a big factor with my Junk by Jenny business. I have a lot of expenses that go with upcycling, buying paint, advertising for my sale that's on Thursday. So revenue will come in for me on Thursday, but I also have to let all of the expenses with a Thursday sale follow that revenue. So to keep my accountant happy, And to keep Uncle Sam happy, I'm going to match all of those expenses with when I used them. The tricky part for me is I go buy a gallon of paint at Ace. Is that an expense? If I'm using accrual basis accounting, am I going to list that as an expense when I bought it? Yes. What happens if I use half a can of my paint and then keep it for the next fiscal period? Well, then I have to, that leads into tomorrow's lesson, because I am going to bump things up a little bit. Tomorrow we're going to talk about how we adjust for what we used. So again, the revenue recognition principle recognizes revenue when you perform that obligation. Expense recognition principle basically lets the expenses follow the revenue. Money in probably has money out attached to it. If you're having a big sale, people need to know about that, and that shows up as an advertising expense. Or the lights were on. Or you're paying your employees during that busy sale. Well, all of those expenses, salary and wages expense, utility expense, advertising expense, all have to be recognized at the same time. Here's a little review question for you. Really analyze that and see if you can answer it correctly. What's the answer? A lot of vocab terms there, isn't there? It's D. What's false about D? It's not following accrual-based. And the revenue and expense recognition principles, right? Here's another one. Can you guys do this one? What's number one? What's the definition for accrual basis accounting? Yes, it is. How would you define a calendar year? Could that be the fiscal year as well? Could fiscal year differ? What is a fiscal year often based on? Ending it during a slow time. Time period assumption. What's that one? Which is that one? See, you're looking for that economic, accountants divide the economic life into artificial time periods. And how about expense recognition principle? Expenses should follow revenue. Very good. I am going to do this tomorrow. I don't know if I'm going to get through all of it tomorrow, but I think part of me says maybe we should wait until after the long weekend, but I think it'd be a good thing to preview. Maybe I don't dive in completely, but maybe I preview adjusting entries. Maybe I'll find some more videos to show you. And then we actually do the grunt of the work next week. I think I'd like to talk just about the vocabulary that goes with it and maybe show you a couple of videos. So if you have some notes on it, great. I think I'll do more supplemental handouts tomorrow anyway. So as of now, I'd like to do some end of chapter work. If you go in your book to page 133, I'd like to together do questions 1 through 5. All right, I'll do these with you since this is fairly new and very vocab heavy. Question 1, I'm on page 133. A, how does time period assumption affect an accountant's analysis of business transactions? Basically, what's going on in that accounting period? Even if it's the last hour of the last day of your fiscal period, If you give that haircut, you got to record that as a revenue. So what is going on in that time period, whether it's that month or that quarter or that set of 6 months or that fiscal year? What's going on in that time period? 1B, explain terms, fiscal year, calendar year, and interim periods. Why don't you try to put that down before I show you the answer? What's a fiscal year? What's a calendar year? And what are interim periods? One year, from an accounting standpoint, is called a fiscal year. January 1 to December 31 is a calendar year. I'll pause and ask this again. Can they be the same? If they're not, what's it often based on? If a fiscal year varies from the calendar year, what's that based on? How busy your business is or the downtime that it experiences. I would say, and maybe I shouldn't say this 100%, but if I had to guess, I'd say 80% of businesses use the same, fiscal and calendar year. If it's your part-time job, go ask tonight. Ask at Willie's if you're working tonight. Hey, Paul, what's our fiscal year? Is it the same as the calendar year? I can guarantee they'll be impressed that you even asked that question. And then interim periods are anything less than a year. We talked about months, quarters. I mentioned the semi-annual piece. Those are the little interims that make up the components of a fiscal year. 12 months, 4 quarters, 2 semi-annuals. Number 2, define 2 generally accepted accounting principles that relate to adjusting the accounts. Maybe this is, the 2, okay. They're just getting kind of fancy. We're looking for revenue recognition principle and the expense recognition principle. Those 2 principles are GAAP approved because they are accrual basis accounting. Revenue recognition simply says we're going to recognize revenue in the accounting period that it happens, and the same thing with expenses, that they're matched with the revenue that occurs. Money in usually has some money out attached to it. Generally accepted accounting principles, or GAAP, like these ideas, because we are listing them when they happen or occur instead of waiting for the money to show up. Number 3, Susan Zupan, a lawyer, accepts a legal engagement in March, performs the work in April, and is paid in May. If Zupan's law firm prepares monthly financial statements, when should it recognize the revenue from this engagement and why? Yes. when we did the work. March, they're saying, hey, we're going to come to you with this legal engagement. April, we actually did the work. They didn't pay until May. If we had waited to even recognize our work until May, which would that be? Accrual or deferral? Deferral, what's another word for deferral? Cash basis. We're waiting for the money to show up before we even say that we did work. Number 4, why do accrual basis financial statements provide more useful information than cash basis? Under accrual accounting, revenues are recognized when the performance obligation is satisfied. We're recognizing when it happens instead of gambling that we might not get the money. We'll worry about if we can't recover the money later, and we'll backtrack, but more often than not, we're going to get the money. That last sentence, trends in revenues are thus more meaningful. For example, are sales good in December? Most of the time, because people are holiday shopping. Well, if all of a sudden there's this big drop in sales in December, we can, from an analytical standpoint, try to figure out why. When are a lot of TVs sold? During that Black Friday, Cyber Monday time, and then they kind of drop off, and then they usually pick up again right around Super Bowl time. So we're looking at those sales trends. If all of a sudden something is pulled out from under us, then we can analyze those. Instead of waiting for the money, we can watch the revenue trends. Finally, number 5. In completing the engagement in question 3, so back to that lawyer one, Zupan pays no costs in March, $2,000 worth of costs in April, and $2,500 in May. That happened in April. How much expense should the firm deduct from revenues in the month when it recognizes the revenue? Okay, so remember, we're recognizing the revenue when? April. But with the expense recognition principle, we're also bundling the expenses to offset the revenue. So if you actually take a look at it, the expenses of $4,500 should be deducted from the revenue in April. Under the expense recognition principle, expenses should be matched with revenues. So we had $2,000 in April, $2,500 in May, even though it's referencing what happened. Keep in mind it was this one legal engagement that might have happened in April. They paid us in May, but we had $4,500 total in expenses. That event, that one economic event of this lawyer doing this work, had several months worth of expenses tied to it.